I want to break down the biggest myth about Israel, which is that Jews everywhere wanted it to exist. Now, I understand why people think this. Everyone knows that Israel was created in the aftermath of the Shoah after World War II. And therefore they assume that the Jewish population around the world, battered and broken by those events, must have all seen the creation of the State of Israel as this sort of godsend moment, and that everyone was on board with it. But nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, whether the State of Israel should be created was one of the most intense debates in Jewish history, and plenty of Jews were vehemently against it. Jewish arguments against the creation of the State of Israel came in two flavors: religious and political. The religious arguments against the creation of the State of Israel are the easiest to understand, I think, so let's go into them first. Circa 70 CE, the Second Temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, and for the past 2,000 years, Jews have considered themselves in exile. Now, we are taught that we will all return to that land when the Messiah comes. But since the Messiah isn't here yet, a lot of Jews believed it would actually be sacrilegious to go and colonize that land again. Until the dead rise up from their graves and the descendant of King David comes to take us back there, who are we to tell God it's time to go back right now instead of when God wants us to go back? By the way, there are some extremely religious Jews who live in Israel and do not consider the Israeli government legitimate because it was not established by a descendant of King David and there is no Messiah or Mashiach. So that's the religious side. Now let's talk about the political side of why a lot of Jews thought the creation of Israel would be a very bad idea. The first is that a lot of them pointed out, hey, there's people living there now, we can't just go in and colonize it. You know, the thing they ended up being extremely right about. But the other thing, the other political argument, was that Jews had found themselves scattered all across the world, and they were deeply involved in various cultures around the world. They were European, they were Russian, they were etc., etc. And so a lot of Jews said, well, wherever we find ourselves, we have to make that our homeland. Not in the sense of, gaining political influence and establishing a Jewish government, but in the more egalitarian sense of we need to set up a society where all people of all ethnicities and races and genders and whatever other identity can feel safe and protected. Because Jews were often not protected. Jews were often the subject of attacks and pogroms and libels. And so they understood firsthand what it meant not to feel welcomed in the country you find yourself in. And so a lot of them had a political project referred to as daikot, which translates from Yiddish to mean here-ness. That is the sense that wherever you find yourself, you should try to establish an egalitarian society where Jews and everyone else are free to live. And one of the things that makes me so mad is how hard Israel has worked to stamp out every line of Jewish thinking that does not support its apartheid, its colonization, and refuses to acknowledge the sheer breadth of Jewish opinion that existed before it came in and sucked all the air out of the room. What makes me even more furious is the way that Israel still leverages the history of the Shoah, of what happened to Jews during World War II, to emphasize and justify its continued oppression of another people. Now, I've made videos in the past about how it is anti-Semitic for non-Jews to compare Israeli Jews to Nazis, and that is true. But I have personal experience with how that history is used to try and indoctrinate Jews outside of Israel into supporting the Zionist cause. In my K-12 Jewish day school, they would often call assemblies in the gym, and we would all file in there. And then a Holocaust survivor would give a speech and tell us about the horrors that happened to them in Germany and the rest of Europe during that time. Then, after that speaker left the stage, some ambassador or diplomat from Israel would come up and start telling us about how we have to support Israel to prevent that from happening again. Remember, he's speaking to children after they were just told about horrors that happened to their ancestors that they can't even begin to wrap their minds around. And now this official of a foreign state is trying to connect that generational trauma to supporting a foreign government. And to anyone who's been through similar things and sees this and hasn't deprogrammed themselves, you need to internalize how absolutely fucked up that is to do to kids. Israel also has the birthright program, which gives free trips to Israel to any Jew who lives abroad. And by the way, that program was primarily funded by American right-wing billionaire Sheldon Adelstein, who died a few years ago, and who was also heavily involved in Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's ongoing corruption scandals. I went on one of those trips, despite supporting Palestine, first of all, because I needed to see firsthand how that propaganda works. And let me tell you, putting a bunch of Jewish 18 to 25-year-olds together in a setting that really encourages hookups and plying them with alcohol is a great way to indoctrinate people into just loving whatever country you've given them a free trip to. Partway through our trip, we were joined by a group of Israeli soldiers who remained with us for the last week of the trip. These soldiers were so clearly instructed to just be friendly with us and to answer all of our questions in a way that framed Israel positively. But it was pretty clear they didn't really like us. They were just there to play the role of gracious hosts, ambassadors enlisted by the State of Israel, to make us fall even more in love with it. And when you realize how much money, time, and effort is put into continuously trying to brainwash other people around the world into accepting the political realities of your unjustified apartheid, well, it's very clear that that effort has to be put in for a reason. It's very clear that if that effort was not put in, people would start to see through the charade. Which brings me to my final point, and by the way, if you've stuck with me this far, consider giving me a follow or a like. Israel weaponizes the concept of anti-Semitism regardless of how it hurts other Jews. Because they claim to represent Jews, they can then make the false claim that any criticism of their government is a criticism of all Jews in general and is therefore anti-Semitic. Now this is a bit like crying wolf, because then, when actual anti-Semitism happens around the rest of the world, Israel's nowhere to be found. They don't speak for Jews anywhere outside of their borders. And because they spend so much time claiming that any criticism of their apartheid regime is anti-Semitism, people who complain about anti-Semitism, when it's really happening, get brushed off, because they are then lumped in with the people who are defending apartheid.